equal value of life you're gained. So the EDLYG still offers payers a means of refusing access to an effective and beneficial drug, and it doesn't address the undervaluing of quality of life improvements that come from using population surveys. It also doesn't fix that the QALYs rely on randomized clinical trials and ignore clinical knowledge. So ultimately, QALY-based systems are just less effective than condition-specific means of assessment. PIPC's chairman, Tony QALY, often says that no patient is average. QALYs ignore differences in patient needs and preferences because they are based on averages. Think about this new age of personalized and precision medicine. We now know and can better understand that different people respond differently to the same drugs. And for many conditions, such disparities are reflected in the clinical knowledge, but not yet in the research literature. What this means is that your doctor is better apt to tell if a treatment will work for you based on what is seen firsthand with other patients that share your characteristics. Tony often notes that the epilepsy drug that works for him is not the drug that is typically preferred on the formulary. But if he were to switch those drugs, he would likely go back to having seizures. So that's just one example, and I'm sure all of you have other great examples of that same trend. As I mentioned earlier, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review is the organization that conducts value assessment of treatments using the quality adjusted life year metric. So let's talk specifically about their methodological challenges. So this slide just tells you that you are not alone. ICER is reviewing a multitude of conditions in 2020. Next week, they're going to be holding their in-person meeting, for instance, on a study of treatments for migraine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ICER's evolution and how they kind of came to be. ICER was founded in 2006, but it only became well-known and influential as it gained wide support from insurers, pharmacy benefit managers, and policymakers. At PIPC, we really started paying attention when ICER was directly referenced in a proposed rulemaking related to how Medicare Part B would reimburse and cover drugs. Because of ICER's use of QALYs and our concerns about average cost effectiveness being used as an excuse for restricted access, patient groups opposed the demonstration and it was eventually rescinded. But then in 2017, ICER announced a partnership with the Veterans Administration. Veterans groups wrote the VA secretary opposing the partnership, but as far as we know, it does continue. We are seeing now that drugs that ICER concludes to be low or intermediate value are often not covered under the VA national formulary. After the VA partnership, a group called the Arnold Foundation, which is now called Arnold Ventures, granted ICER $13.9 million to do value assessments of new drugs. And when I say new drugs, I mean new drugs just as they're coming into the market. As we understand, Arnold has now given ICER closer to $20 million in total. With this investment, ICER and Arnold Ventures have convinced states to refer to ICER's value assessments in their Medicaid programs, starting with the state of New York, which was the first to collaborate with ICER on the value of a cystic fibrosis drug. Later in 2018, CVS Caremark announced that they would offer employers a benefit design that would only cover drugs up to $100,000 cost per QALY, also based on ICER's assessments. We've been working hard with CVS in terms of meetings to try to mitigate implementation of that kind of program, but it is still out there. So in terms of the flaws in ICER's methods, and some of this will be repetitive, we vehemently have pushed back on ICER because of its methods and how its studies are used to restrict access. We've already discussed the reliance on discriminatory methods. We are also frustrated that ICER tends to sidestep ethical problems related to using QALYs in healthcare decision-making. They know payers use their studies to restrict access, but are not holding themselves accountable. When ICER puts together its voting panels that determine whether a treatment represents low, intermediate, or high value, they do not put patients or clinical experts that treat the disease in question on that panel. Dr. Pearson once told a parent who articulated frustration about having to put a value on the life of her child, this child had Duchenne muscular dystrophy. His quote was, "That's why we don't have you vote." So ICER yields its power because its studies are referenced by payers. It is not their job to conduct studies that are usable by patients. So they value treatments strictly from the health system and insurer perspectives. This can lead to situations where it's more valuable not to provide care to some patients because to do so would not be cost effective. We also worry that ICER's assessments are premature. Randomized clinical trials are not conducted in the real world and largely represent subpopulations. So the rush to deliver payers and policymakers value assessments immediately upon FDA approval has led to hasty reviews based on early assumptions, oversimplified models, and incomplete data. With so many things, as with so many things, the ICER assessment process is also a black box, leaving patients and people with disabilities in the dark on the assumptions used and the important limitations that may have impacted the results. So in terms of lack of meaningful patient engagement, we actually called upon a firm to help us look at studies that had been, or feedback that had been given to ICER, and to determine the extent to which that feedback was incorporated into their final reports. As you can see from this chart, only half of the time of industry and others was patient input even incorporated. So only 15% of the time was the input that was provided by patients actually then incorporated into ICER studies. So that's been a very disturbing and I think trend that hopefully will be changing in 2020. I think they finally have realized that they need to do a better job of not just listening to patients, but actually incorporating their input. So as you enter the sickle cell disease treatment assessment, it's important to understand also how ICER's methods exacerbate disparities. ICER is largely reliant on randomized clinical trials that do not reflect subpopulations, and in fact, the risk profile of an average person is likely to be a proxy closely aligned to someone who is white, middle-aged, and male. As we've discussed, ICER uses a population perspective, so averages, for its cost-effectiveness modeling framework. ICER does not account for genetic background, demographics, risk and comorbidities. The weights of health states for translation into QALYs are undertaken in predominantly white populations. And in fact, the selection and construction of the domains that make up quality of life tools were constructed by a small group of elderly white men 20 years ago in Switzerland, which is an interesting source that we recently uncovered. So why do we care about ICER and QALYs so much? Let's first take a look back. In 2010, when the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, known as QALY, was created, there was a provision in its statute that explicitly said that QALY could not study the effectiveness of treatments based on quality-adjusted life years, nor could Medicare use QALYs to determine coverage, reimbursement, and incentive programs. In 1992, then, HHS rejected Oregon's waiver application that would have prioritized its covered services for Medicaid based on QALYs and cost effectiveness, which HHS cited as potentially violating the Americans with Disabilities Act. So a long history of policymakers recognized that QALY is discriminating. And specifically talking about the Oregon health plan, it's interesting that at the time, the Oregon waiver rejection was apparently very controversial, leading that HHS secretary to write a letter to the New York Times about it, stating his position that the proposal included provisions that were not permitted by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So why do QALYs matter? One study looked at ICER's determinations of low, intermediate, and high value, and then looked at treatments for psoriasis, multiple myeloma, non-small cell lung cancer, multiple sclerosis, and rheumatoid arthritis. If Medicaid based its drug formulary on ICER studies, the study found that most patients would have to switch treatments. All patients with MS would have to switch. 87% of patients with rheumatoid arthritis would have to switch. The outcomes were even worse in Medicare. A study looked at the ICER value of treatments for rheumatoid arthritis, MS, non-small cell lung cancer, and multiple myeloma, and determined that more than half of patients would have to switch treatments if ICER were used to determine formularies. It was worse for multiple sclerosis patients. So these numbers haven't been updated since the last study. The last ICER study was done late last year, but it gives you an idea. Internationally, other countries tend to rely on quality-adjusted life years and similar summary metrics to determine what they will or will not cover in their healthcare programs. Cancer studies show worse outcomes for cancer survival in those countries, fewer options for cancer medicines, and slower access to new cancer medications. If you follow PIPC on Twitter, we often share stories from other countries related to treatments that they refuse to cover, which are treatments disproportionately for conditions that have a disabling outcome. We're also concerned that, despite the Oregon precedent, President Trump's budget invited states to make drug coverage decisions that meet state needs. And what this is translated into is that in 2018, CMS opened the door to restricted coverage in their response to a Massachusetts proposed Medicaid waiver that was looking to do restricted formularies. New York has already endorsed using QALYs and ICER, now having used ICER studies related to reimbursement for cystic fibrosis treatment and migraine. Massachusetts is considering policies to use QALYs and ICER, but have experienced significant pushback from the Massachusetts Disability Policy Consortium and from patient organizations. California's Legislative Analyst Office provided recommendations to consider New York's model, which uses ICER. Most recently, we learned that California is considering a policy that is modeled on President Trump's proposal to reference international prices, despite that those countries use QALYs to determine treatment value and tend to discriminate in how they cover drugs. We recently found that Oklahoma has referenced ICER's QALY-based studies to impose prior authorization requirements in their Medicaid program. We also know that Tennessee submitted a Medicaid waiver proposal to use cost effectiveness to limit formularies, which could be based on ICER studies. But advocacy organizations have sent a letter to CMS opposing that proposed Medicaid waiver last December. In terms of federal activities, we're watching legislation that passed the House of Representatives that would implicate the use of quality-adjusted life years in our healthcare system and potentially undermine the law against the use of QALYs in Medicare. The House and Senate are still trying to find agreement on policies that would lower drug prices between now and May 22nd, so we're keeping a really close eye on these potential implications for QALYs. If they don't come to an agreement, we do worry that the administration will still advance its international pricing index that would potentially reference the QALY-based value determinations that are from other countries. So now let's take a more focused look at the ICER assessment of sickle cell disease treatments. It's our hope today that, that we can help you as advocates prepare for that value assessment. So today, ICER has developed its key stakeholders list and a scoping document and timeline for that assessment. On January 22nd, we expect to have a draft evidence report from ICER. On January 27th, and I'm sorry, that's not on the chart, at 4:30, we hope that you'll hold your calendars. We're going to be sending out after this webinar an invitation to participate in a future webinar with sickle cell advocacy organizations about the draft evidence report and about the meeting agenda, which should also become available on January 22nd. And then on March 26th, ICER is going to be holding an in-person meeting in Boston where they will officially vote on the quote-unquote long-term value for money of new treatments. And then on April 16th, ICER will issue its final report. So as a follow-up to this webinar, we do hope that you will let us know if you are interested in being interviewed on video or writing down your story in a blog or opinion piece. We'd love to capture people's stories to ensure that patient perspectives on the value of treatments are heard by policymakers and payers. All right, so I'm now gonna turn it over. Let's move to the next slide. I'm gonna wait for, oh, is she on? So now I'm gonna turn it over to Latasha Lee at the American Society for Hematology to learn more about treatment options today and in the future.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we got you. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. So I'm Latasha Lee from the American Society of Hematology's Research Collaborative, and I'm pleased to give you a brief update on the kind of therapeutic landscape. So as you all know, up until about a few months ago, there were only 2 FDA-approved therapies for sickle cell disease. However, the interesting thing is that the molecular basis of sickle cell disease was established over 100 years ago. Yet we're just now starting to see some of the improvements. And so even though there's only 4 FDA-approved therapies for sickle cell disease, we're at an unprecedented time in sickle cell disease research and treatment, where the potential for more therapeutics is really beginning to have an uptick. There's a very rich sickle cell disease therapeutic pipeline with over 40 therapies in development for sickle cell disease. You can see from this slide at the very bottom that these therapeutics are in various stages of development. However, based on a number of the challenges that rare disease clinical trial development faces, as well as the sickle cell disease landscape for research, these therapeutics face a number of challenges, and access will be key. And so that's really why I really wanted to give an update to you to provide you kind of what the future of sickle cell disease treatment could look like and why it's important that value assessments take into mind what the sickle cell community needs, because not all of these therapeutics that are available now and or in the future address all of the major concerns of the sickle cell community, and they're not just pain. So with that, I'm happy to pass things off or either answer any questions regarding the future therapeutic options for sickle.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I'm now going to turn
You're
it
welcome.
to Ashley Valentine to talk a little bit about the work that Sickle has been doing in this ICER assessment process.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Ashley Valentine, and I am co-founder and president of Sickle. And Sickle is a sickle cell disease advocacy nonprofit, and we focus on storytelling to elevate the voices of the sickle cell disease community. And our goal is to eliminate stigma and influence decision makers. I like to tell people my personal connection with sickle cell disease is that my older brother Marcus is 36 years old, and he lives with sickle cell disease. So this slide here kind of gives us an update of what Sickle has done since ICER announced the topic of reviewing the 3 sickle cell disease medications. We knew that a community group needed to step in to ensure that the patient voice was being heard. We also knew that ICER moves forward with these reviews with or without patients, so we felt it was really important to bring the patient perspective to the forefront of this type of review. So some of you may remember that back in September, it was an open comment period, and Sickle submitted comments from the patient community. And we also worked with various member orgs and other community-based organizations from the sickle cell disease space to submit a sign-on letter. And in total, there were 21 organizations that signed on to the letter to ICER and 3 individual stakeholders, and the stakeholders were medical professionals. And the goal of this sign-on letter was to show ICER that the sickle cell disease community had a united front. We also led a 4-part webinar series recently on value assessment and drug pricing. And we initiated a task force in partnership with the SCDAA so that we can reach various regions of the US and work with community leaders to educate during the ICER review. Great. So one of the initiatives that we're working on with the task force is a survey called My Life with Sickle Cell Disease, and their survey is live today. All of the areas that are identified in this survey are areas that we've identified with ICER that are missing data. So we've learned today that ICER builds their economic models off of clinical trial data, and many of us in the community understand that clinical trial data is not what goes on the ground from a real world perspective. So we've worked with ICER to identify gaps where we could collect more data in order to ensure that the patient voice is reflected in the economic model. So some of the areas that we've identified are day-to-day cost and activities in regards to sickle cell disease. So what I mean by that is day-to-day costs would be out-of-pocket costs. So costs like gasoline to get the doctor's appointments, time missed from work, because of sickle cell disease, those types of items are not captured in data. So we want to hear from real patients and caregivers on those costs. Another area we're capturing are the impacts of sickle cell disease. So if you go into crisis or if you are fatigued, how many days missed from work, how many days missed from school. And a big, large piece of the survey is that we are capturing information from caregivers. Caregiver data is not captured in clinical trials, and we really want to hear from the caregivers as well about the economic impacts of sickle cell disease to you. So our ask here is to complete the survey. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and we can get you the information you need. The second piece here is submit your story to ICER during the public comment period. So right now we are working on the survey, but we will be working with the task force and various other sickle cell organizations during the public comment period so that we can ensure that patients have the opportunity to submit their comments to ICER. Great.
Thank you. So I want to just talk a little bit then, and then I'm going to turn it over to Beverly. But just in terms of what you can do, and I want to reiterate from what Ashley said as well, that I think there are 2 points to take from Latasha and Ashley. Number one is that ICER does these studies a lot, and they'll be doing it on the treatments of today and the treatments of tomorrow and the future. While ICER's methodology, in our opinion, is not a great one, it is important to engage to the extent that you can to make sure that they have as much information as they can to end up in the best place possible. So Ashley, really appreciate that you've put together that survey. I think that's a really great step. And for folks that have the time and the bandwidth, it's really important, I think, to fill out that survey just to make sure that that kind of data is making it into the hands of folks that are going to be making those decisions. I also just want to clarify, that we want to be helpful in terms of making sure that patient voices and caregivers are at the forefront. So if you have any interest in engaging from a communication standpoint, whether it's videos that we take or being interviewed or submitting opinion pieces and blogs to your local newspapers to highlight what you go through, what the burdens of the disease are so that people can understand the value of treatment, we're always happy to do that as well. So after this webinar, we'll be providing some additional information. First, we'll share that survey link with you. We'll also share more information about the next webinar and invite you to reach out to us and let us know if you would like to try to use your voice in some other way as well. So I'm going to turn it over now to Beverly. Beverly, thank you so much for all of your leadership and for helping us to get the word out about the webinar today. We really appreciate it. There you go. So Beverly, I think you're off of mute. I wanted to see if you wanted to add a few thoughts here at the end. That's okay. We probably are having technical difficulties. It's inevitable when you do one of these webinars that there's always some sort of technical difficulty. If people have questions, I also want to make sure that we have an opportunity to answer them. If you look in the box where you're logged in, there's a place where you can type in messages and submit questions. I'd be more than happy to have, for us to answer a few questions now that we're here towards the end.
This is Beverly. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you. Yay, thank you.
Oh, technology.
I know.
I realized I was speaking and no one could hear me.
It happens to me all the time.
It's okay. I just wanted to thank everyone for your participation today, and definitely the partnership with ASH and Sickle and the partnership to improve patient care and all of our sickle cell advocates around the country has made this webinar possible. So we definitely want to invite questions now from the audience.
Great, thank you, Beverly. And while we're waiting, I'll just say, you know, for all of you on the phone, I will just tell you, you have great leaders in the community. It's very impressive. Just the genuine and authentic and hardworking people that you have advocating on behalf of patients in the sickle cell community. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, and we will also be sending out the survey to everyone across the country and encourage everyone to send it out to their connections as well.
That's fantastic, Beverly. I think that's going to be a really key next step in this process with ICER to make sure they have good information.
Yes. Do we have any questions?
So I cannot see the screen from here, so I'm going to walk towards it. Okay, so I have here a question for Tasha. It says, you referenced the many other therapeutics in development. Can you speak to what complications some of those treatments focus on aside from pain?
Okay, can you repeat the question again, please?
Yeah, it says, you referenced therapeutics in development. Can you speak to what complications some of those treatments focus on?
So I can't speak to all 40 of them in the time that we have here today, but a number of the therapeutics that are in development for sickle cell disease range from things that could address some of the other complications, including acute stress, some of the chronic conditions resulting from acute chest, other comorbidities, and things that the current landscape does not address. So some of them are actually looking at ways to innovate the bone marrow transplant process to allow for the stem cells to be harvested easier through circulation. And we're working on, through the ASH Research Collaborative, kind of an overview of what the future of sickle cell therapeutics could look like and where investigations are looking. Additionally, there's a lot of investigator-initiated clinical trials and research that is not captured in those 40+, and some of those are looking at some of the alternatives to non-opioid pain treatments for sickle cell disease. So stay tuned, and please in the future visit the ASHRC website, where we can provide you additional information about the future therapeutic landscape.
Thanks, Latasha. We appreciate you jumping on. So another question was, how many stories are you trying to capture from the patient population? You know, I would say it's important in the context of the survey for everyone to participate. The more participation, the more robust the data, the more likely it is to have an influence. Ashley, do you want to speak to how many patients are going to be expected to be heard from specifically at the ICER in-person meeting?
So can we take a step back to also comment about the survey? So our goal is to capture as many stories as we can, and we're looking for, or as many responses as we can. So 300 would be a good amount. So we need for everyone to work together in their communities to take the survey. And because the survey is a caregiver and a patient survey, if you think about family units, for every one person, you know, you can also ask that one person with sickle cell, can a parent or a spouse or any person who takes care of them, can they too take the survey? And multiple parents can take the survey even if they have the same child or adult with sickle cell disease. So that's to answer that question. Another important note about the survey is that it closes January 31st. So it's open for 2 weeks. We will have various touch points throughout the process to give the community updates about the numbers.
Great, thank you. So another question that I have here is, are there differences in ICER evaluations for drugs versus genetic cures? So when I was talking about the equal value life gain metric earlier, that metric is a metric that I think ICER is depending on more in the context of cures. They are also updating their framework on how they look at cures. But generally speaking, they still use that quality adjusted life year metric. So the nuances in terms of the underlying methodology it's still a flaw. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. Let's see, it says, are there ways that we can advocate with locally elected officials in regards to the potential outcomes of the ICER process? So I would argue, and welcome feedback from others, yes, I think, so we would encourage you to follow the Partnership to Improve Patient Care and our Value Our Health initiative. It's PIPCpatients.org and valueourhealth.org. I think where the advocacy organizations have been weighing in from sort of, a non-disease specific level is to encourage policymakers not to reference quality-based studies in public programs. And so we're going to be continuing that. We understand that ICER exists and we have to engage in that process because it is a process that is ongoing and it is often used by private payers. But to the extent possible, we can certainly be working with policymakers to make sure that those studies are not influencing Medicare and Medicaid. So there's also a question here. I know the focus here is on ICER, however, they do not have the final say. What are we doing as a community to reach out and tell our story directly to payers? So there have been examples in the past of certain disease focus areas where after the ICER study is done and final, some communities will then do a joint letter out to payers explicitly talking about the value proposition from a patient perspective. The goal there is obviously to sort of shift the discussion from being just about ICER to being more of a patient-centered discussion. That is something that I think, is certainly a tactic that could be considered by the sickle cell community after the fact when ICER's report is final. And also I think, one of the reasons that we have been talking about wanting to get opinion pieces into the mix, whether they're, whether it's a video or an interview with a patient, is to make sure that the narrative around sickle cell disease is understood in very real terms in terms of the experience of patients and not just what is articulated in an academic study. So here, can we go down to the next? Is there? Latasha, there's a question here about which products are considered in phase 3, or, oh, sorry, 4. It says, are these both the GBT?
So yes, currently the phase 4 therapeutics are the 2 new approved drugs, and there has been consideration of Indari doing a phase 4 study. And typically phase 4 studies are those long-term follow-up studies that FDA requires post-market, so that they're looking for additional efficacy of the drug and future indications of the drug. So those 2 that are currently in there are the 2 approved therapeutics, the recent GBT as well as Novartis drug.
So, Beverly, Ashley, another question then is has there been any communication then with the payer community about those products that just came onto market?
I'm sorry, was that question for me? I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, for any of you, I think it's y'all would do better than, because I just am trying to, the question is the extent to which payers have already received some communication from the sickle cell community around those products, or whether, or is that something that's being discussed? That was just a question that came up on the chat. we may have to follow up on that one. But it's a good question, and I think worthy of discussion, especially now. So there's another question about, is there a way to capture people who can no longer work because of sickle cell disease? So some people have lost their salaries, costing them thousands, and their families must make up the difference, which is important data to include. Is that the kind of data, Ashley, that's included in the survey?
Hi, yes, this is Ashley. Exactly. So we want to capture that type of information. So days missed of work, if you can't work anymore because of sickle cell disease, that's exactly like days missed from school, childcare, all of those indirect costs that you are accumulating because of sickle cell disease. We are capturing all of that in the survey, and we hope to in the survey.
Great. And actually, the survey is on the Sickle Cells website, is that right?
We are uploading the survey onto the website, and then we will also have the survey going on our social media links and in the task force social media. And so actually the survey is on the website now, so thank you for asking that, and then you'll be able to find updates across social media.
That's great. And Beverly, I assume you're going to put it on your website as well. And then and we also have, if you go to valueourhealth.org/sickle cell, we haven't added it yet, but we will add the survey to that website as well, just so that it's easily accessible to anyone anywhere. So we'll work with our partners to make sure that it's readily available from all of the sickle cell advocacy organizations. That's a really good point. Let's see. I'm looking at looking to see if we have any new questions. I don't see any new ones. Let's see, we're getting close to time anyway. Sorry, I'll come back. I apologize. I have to stand closer to the screen to view the questions. But anyway, thank you to everybody for participating. We really appreciate everything. And if you have additional questions, please feel free to shoot us an email. If I don't have the answers, which I may not, I know Beverly will, or Beverly or Ashley, I'm sure, can be helpful, as well as all of the other sickle cell organizations that have been so wonderful to work with. But we really appreciate it. And Latasha, thank you for also participating. We appreciate you jumping on to present that slide. I know that made a big difference. And Beverly, thank you so much for co-hosting this with us. It really does make a difference to have so much engagement from so many organizations. All right, well, absent any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And I hope that this was helpful just in providing a baseline overview of who ICER is, what the quality adjusted life year is, and more information about specifically the ICER report will be forthcoming on that January 27th webinar at 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. Thank you very much, everyone.